In our previous lectures, we've brought our course of study right up to the end of the 20th century. In our lecture today, we'd like to consider the future of terror. In the course of our lectures, we've not been able to mention all of the cases of despotic regimes or of turmoil or ideological conflict in the 20th century, such as Vietnam, Sudan, Iran, Ethiopia, Cuba, Sierra Leone, South Africa. The list could go on and on. But we have sought to indicate cases that spoke to the very largest issues and suggested what some of the trajectories for the future might be. So we'd like in this lecture to examine terror today, ideological claims of movements that are abroad in the world, and not so much to predict the future as to suggest what lessons we might draw from the experience of the 20th century. We've commented in our earlier lectures about the rise of political religions in the form of modern ideologies of the 20th century. Today we see, however, a new variation, even more explicit syntheses of politics, religion, and ideology. The use of traditional religious imagery or ideas fused with political energies promising a perfect world. We'd like to consider some cases of this, from a Japanese cult to suicide bombers to radical Islamist ideology as well. On March 20th, 1995, an attack took place in Tokyo. The Aum Shinrikyo, or Supreme Truth cult, released sarin gas in Tokyo's subways, leaving 12 dead and thousands injured in an attack that seemed to be entirely irrational, seemed to serve no conceivable purpose. And yet, within the ideological mindset of this group, their aim had been to bring along or hurry along a religious apocalypse. They were driven by the teachings of their spiritual master, Shoko Asahara, who drew on traditional Buddhism but then had gone far afield, turning to predictions of apocalypse and the nearing end of civilization as we knew it, a message perhaps of renewal through violence. Rather than simply await the end of the world, however, this cult tried to accelerate the coming of apocalypse. They had at first sought to develop a scientific earthquake machine that could produce natural disasters, and then had fallen back on the idea of the use of poison sarin. Another case of the use of technology for murderous ends comes with suicide bombers at work in the world today. Palestinian suicide bombers, both young men and young women, called shahid or martyrs, are increasingly common in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, exploding themselves among civilians. Polls indicate, moreover, that such bombers enjoy wide popularity in their own communities. Most are from religiously oriented groups, including Hamas and Islamic Jihad. And in the process of preaching such suicide with a military purpose, are altering long-standing prohibitions in traditional Islamic belief against suicide. At the same time, secular groupings have also tried to adopt this tactic, as it were, not wanting to be left behind. A particularly prominent instance of the fusion of religion and ideology is radical Islamism. We need to stress here the word itself, Islamism, as distinct from traditional Islamic belief. Islamism synthesizes religious impulses and modern ideology with a political agenda. Radical Islamists view themselves as the carriers of a total ideology with total answers and solutions to the world's problems, superseding the modern Western ideologies that we've discussed in part in our lectures. Now, in a worldwide population of 1 billion Muslims, radical Islamists are only a very small group, and yet they've made up for their small numbers by the fervor of espousing their cause. In spite of an occasional expression of a utopian vision of restoring the caliphate of the 7th century when there was one rule uniting Muslims, the modern Islamists often, in fact, break with traditional Islam in very significant ways. They alter established traditions by identifying Islam with state power and government authority in ways that earlier Islamic thinkers would have considered to be unorthodox. And they have often hardened the prescriptions for personal faith and personal conviction into political dogmas and rules that must be enforced, however harshly. There's also, in particular, one very telling innovation of the Islamists, which is in stark contrast to traditional Islam. And that is the incorporation into modern Islamist thought of a concept of progress. The concept of progress, as we've seen with the modern Western ideologies that set the 20th century's violent course on its way, as we've seen in our lectures, was a key notion. The notion that a bright future awaited, that things were getting better all the time, perhaps inevitably, but especially if one had the key to history. And this is a notion that was not familiar to traditional Islamic belief. The notion of traditional Islam had been that in the days of the Prophet, in the days of the revelation, one had enjoyed, as it were, a golden age, and that later generations had deviated from it. Rather, the Islamists suggested one could instead imagine a perfected future. And this was something quite new, incorporating some Western ideas. The adherents of Islamism are often from prosperous backgrounds and often students of science or engineering. The movement's use of technology for its ends, its embrace of the machinery of technology, even as it might reject some of its Western context, whether the internet or the use of modern weapons, is characteristic of this blend of modern with religious ideology. We see here also something that runs counter to commonly perceived notions about the roots of terrorism. We're often prone to understand terrorism as a reaction to desperation, to a lack of hope in the future, but the prosperous backgrounds of many terrorists, as well as their own professed determination to live and die for particular ideas, should suggest to us that we need to take their professed beliefs seriously. In spite of denunciations of the West and the preaching of the armed struggle of jihad as a holy war, Islamist thinking is often very heavily influenced by Western ideologies that it has appropriated, even though those depths might not be recognized. An excellent example is a key thinker of Islamist thought, the Egyptian Sayyid Qutb of the Muslim Brotherhood, who studied in the United States and then reacted very violently against the civilization that he had encountered there. But he did so borrowing terms and ideas from Western civilization, but giving some of these ideologies a distinctive twist. In particular, Qutb accepted Marx's timeline of historical stages: feudalism, capitalism, communism, but then did something interesting. He added one more stage after communism, after the dictatorship of the proletariat. And this was to be the triumph of Islamism as an ideology. This was to restore the spiritual dimension that he felt had been neglected in communist ideology, bringing about finally a utopian harmony of human existence. Qutb's writings called for a unitary state, consolidation of political control, and a classless society based upon shared belief that would be achieved through violent means. Similar trends could also be seen in other schools of Islamist thought developing in this period, including revolutionary Iran under Ayatollah Khomeini from 1979. It's crucial to keep this in mind, that Islamism is not a throwback, not a revival, but rather is a modern ideological form, and its ideas need to be considered in this context, as well as its actions. We turn now to consider a prominent case of such motivated terrorism, the September 11th attacks of 2001 and the role of Al-Qaeda. On September 11th, 2001, New York's World Trade Center towers were destroyed by Al-Qaeda terrorists coordinated by their leader Osama bin Laden, and another attack was launched on Washington, D.C. The attack in and of itself was not merely to do damage to the economy, it was also intended as an act of propaganda through terror. Propaganda of the deed, as revolutionaries and anarchists of the start of the 20th century would have called it. It was intended to spread fear, to cripple a society, and to impress upon the rest of the world that the enemies of the Islamists were on the run. In al-Qaeda texts that were later found in Afghanistan after the Taliban hosts of al-Qaeda there were defeated, suicide missions, such as the one of September 11th, were praised in a booklet which was entitled significantly, The Solution. What was offered here was terrorism as a solution. Osama bin Laden, a shadowy figure, was of great importance in stage managing or choreographing these very carefully planned attacks. Who was he? Bin Laden was not of humble origins, but rather was born into a prosperous family in Saudi Arabia. When his father died, he inherited millions from the family's construction empire. He studied in Saudi Arabia without finishing school. Some contemporaries have suggested that he wasn't particularly drawn to a fundamentalist version of religion. But then over time, he seemed to be attracted by radical activists in Central Asia, near Afghanistan, including a man who had become an important ideological ally, the Egyptian Ayman al-Zawahiri. In 1989, bin Laden became the leader of an important group. His, by all accounts, in some respects, charismatic personality helped in achieving this leadership role. He's a tall man, looming over others from his culture as he stands 6 feet tall and 5 inches, 6'5", very quiet, soft-spoken, but a man who is said to have a particular talent as a stage manager or as an impresario of the framing of such attacks for propaganda and public relations effect. The group that he headed came to be called Al-Qaeda, which means the base of operations with a worldwide network. It's significant to consider how this Al-Qaeda group thinks of itself in ideological terms. One word that is used to describe their self-understanding is a word we've seen before in the context of radical ideological movements, the word vanguard. They see themselves as being in the very forefront of a larger ideological wave, which they are showing the way for. We'll recall Lenin's ideas of the Bolsheviks as the vanguard of the workers, showing the way. There are clearly resonances here. In 1996, bin Laden, as an impresario, made a public declaration of jihad against the West, a holy struggle. In 1997, he further added that his plans that he was in the process of organizing would be shown in the future by the media. And I think this wasn't simply an announcement of staying tuned, suggesting that people keep their eyes open for what he would be affecting. I think that the very notion of media attention to these acts is crucial to understanding how a small group aims by such actions to effect, it hopes, worldwide change. In February of 1998, bin Laden and his ally Zawahiri declared in sonorous terms a world Islamic front, arguing that they would have global reach. In many ways, this attempt to muster an international world organization is remarkably reminiscent of ideas we've seen before, of socialist and communist internationals, the organizations that would seek to further a global idea of change. They also issued a fatwa, or a religious ruling, against those they called crusaders, meaning the Westerners, or particularly Americans, and Zionists, meaning Israelis or Jews in general. They ordered the killing of Americans, whether civilian or military, as acts that would further their ideology. Here we see a fusion of terror and ideological visions, the proposal of a utopia to follow. Of the September 11th attacks, bin Laden, in one of the recordings that circulated afterwards as a furthering of this propaganda, is quoted as saying that these attacks are what we instigated for a while in self-defense. Every time they kill us, we kill them, so a balance of terror can be achieved. Those very terms, balance of terror, I think are significant Terror is being endorsed as a tool of politics. Bin Laden followed up on this in a tape that was released in December of 2001, in which he deliberately spoke of the idea of blessed terror, the inspiring of fear, crippling anxiety, in order to tear down one's enemies and their society, is a cornerstone notion of Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. Videos and other documents that were found in Afghanistan in 2002 after the defeat of the group's Taliban hosts showed experiments with chemical weapons, proposals for really vast projects like balloons that would carry poisons to rain down upon the enemy, as well as other planning for terrorist acts. The instances we've just discussed of the fusion of religion and ideology, suicide bombings, and the Al-Qaeda network and Islamism clearly show instances where terror and utopia are still dynamic and active as they were in the 20th century, as the 21st century begins. But we want to ask a fundamental question: why then did all of this happen in the 20th century, and what can we learn from it? The 20th century's long and violent record clearly requires explanation, at least in broad outline. And there are paradoxes aplenty here. The indisputable improvements in sciences and the material progress that did so much to improve the lives of ordinary people in the 20th century also opened up new horizons of what seemed possible in other areas of life, in terms of physical change, in terms of changing the landscape and the environment, and decisively, including social organization as well. And this was, in a way, a killing paradox, because that optimism about utopian possibilities would then inevitably lead to frustration with the obstacles that stood in the way of realizing those hopes. Whether those obstacles were the material limits of one's reality and physical obstacles, whether they were the limits of rationality, or whether, in this case, fatally, whether they were people who stood in the way of realization of ideologies. Again and again, as we've seen, glorious ends, the best of intentions, were used to justify any means, including violence, coercion, and terror. And the shape of modern politics, with its mass nature and popular nature, had a lot to do with this intensity of political confrontation. Modern popular politics, whether in the form of democracy or in the form of totalitarian attempts to orchestrate the masses and set them marching off towards the brave future, all injected new mass forces into the international and domestic political arenas and gave new power and potency to politics. Furthermore, ideas and beliefs played an important role as well, one that's difficult to measure. The decline of traditional religious belief might have left a hunger for meaning in modern man that was to be filled by political faith. Ultimately, the readiness to undertake both utopian experiment and terror, however, depended on what I think is the bottom line of these questions: the views that were held about human nature and what it was and what could be done. Hannah Arendt, in her stunning dissection of the trends of the 20th century, quotes a haunting phrase. And that epigram is that normal people do not know that anything is possible. What she meant by that was that civilization at its best, in some sense, places limits on what human beings can do to human beings. Totalitarian societies eliminate those limits, feeling that the nature of man is something to be manipulated rather than respected. We think back to our discussion of how Chairman Mao had mused on the beauty of human beings precisely because they were blank pages on which one could write whatever one wanted, new and wonderful things. I think that really captures one view. But another view of human nature is captured by those people whom we've discussed who have dissented or have resisted against such regimes, people who were witnesses to the century's violence and despotism. They had a different view of mankind, a different view of human nature, which saw the human being not as something to be manipulated or pushed around in population movements and displacements, but rather as something intrinsically inviolable and durable, something with a human dignity of the individual that should not be violated. In particular, we've noted again and again in our lectures and our discussion of despotic regimes the jokes that even people under the repressive grasp of these regimes have time and again told about their regime's shortcomings. These regimes were perhaps not ultimately threatened by such jokes, but those jokes on the part of the suppressed populations that I've tried to weave in now and again into our discussion do suggest that these regimes all ultimately didn't manage to finally quell that last spark of resistance, that sense of irony, or in this case, dark humor, that would still be an abiding part of human reality. Institutions in the form of governments played a very large role in setting the 20th century on its course. We might ask whether institutions might also offer some solutions to these problems for the future. Many have looked to the United Nations as an embodiment of those ideals which earlier the League of Nations had sought to embody. But from its founding, the United Nations was a collection of states, not a world government with sovereign power. Rather, it has often very usefully been an arena for discussion. But it's been an arena which has included states whose interests as well as conception of the world have sometimes been irreconcilable, including democracies as well as dictatorships. And thus the United Nations has not been immune from the contradictions of politics and ideology. To give but one example, in 2002, Libya, a state declared sponsoring terrorism, chaired the Human Rights Committee of the United Nations, illuminating these contradictions. During the time of the Rwandan genocide, the government of Rwanda was a member of the rotating Security Council members. In crises like Bosnia, Kosovo, or Rwanda, as we've seen, appeals to an international community have sometimes paradoxically served precisely to release individual nations from taking responsibility for action. Some hope that the International Criminal Court, established in 2002, might change this picture with claims to universal jurisdiction. But there are some anxieties by some nations like the United States which decline to participate, which are concerned about implications for national sovereignty, which is the basis for democratic responsibility and democratic accountability. But a level that's even deeper than that of institutions and governments is one that I'd like to consider as well. And that is the baseline level of the individual, and how the individual's human rights and human being are regarded in politics and by ourselves. In other words, this is the question of how we think about human nature. This is an old debate in philosophy and one that's likely to continue, but it's key in our context. Much of the confrontation in the 20th century with utopias, their hopes, disappointments, and terrors, centered on issues of human nature and whether that nature can be changed. The fundamental question was this, the abiding question. Is there one essential human nature which is enduring and durable, which can be folded, spindled, and mutilated, but which will bounce back? Or is man something different? A product of environment, education, social influence, perhaps infinitely changeable and open to influence. This is a model which MIT psychologist Steven Pinker has referred to as the blank slate theory. One notable and widely respected historian of ideas, the late Isaiah Berlin, spoke, I think, very eloquently to this abiding question of human nature. In his entire work of the history of modern ideas, and he himself was a remarkable witness of the 20th century in his own work and thinking, he took as the central model for his own work a quote from the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. He talked about the crooked timber of humanity. Kant's aphorism of the crooked timber of humanity suggested that human beings are that crooked timber. They're made up of a material that's so complex, so organic, so grown, and crooked in the sense of being distinctive and individual and unique, that nothing entirely straight, as this aphorism continues, nothing entirely straight can be carved or shaped or molded from human nature. What was meant by that was that a human individuality doesn't fit, according to Isaiah Berlin, the neat schemes and utopian frameworks that are suggested by the ideologies we've discussed. A central paradox, however, is this. Perhaps it is in human nature to imagine utopias in which that human nature is overcome. People need visions of a future. We need the notion of a better tomorrow in order to get up in the morning and to set about with some hope and vitality about our everyday business. But technology might play a role here as well. Perhaps we're nearing a new threshold in our debate on human nature. Is the utopian dream of changing human nature and manipulating it about to be accomplished by technology? In our own times, advances in genetic engineering and in pharmacology are accelerating at such a dizzying pace that some social critics are worrying that the consideration, the thinking through of the long-term implications of this technological change might yet be lagging behind. Aldous Huxley's surmise in his fictional work, The Brave New World, that cloning would someday yield a new human condition and a new human nature is perhaps about to be tested in reality. Is a post-human future in store for us? That's a question well worth considering. Let's ask in conclusion what lessons one might learn from the long and violent record of the 20th century. What lessons might emerge from studying its record of utopian terror? We might return to the key elements that made up the regimes we've considered in order to consider their lessons. Those key elements were masses, machines, mobsters, and master plans. In terms of the role that masses played, one sees the importance, by contrast, of emphasizing for a healthy model of society the value of individuality. Not in the sense of being a lonely, atomized individual, but rather individuals who unfold their own characters but are still embedded in true everyday human community, civic society, rather than given over to the loneliness of crowds. Genuine individuals are likely to be better able to resist that marching impulse of organized crowds that ideological regimes sought to create. While machines of control were important to tyrannies, technology itself, as we've seen, is clearly neither unequivocally a curse nor an unproblematic answer, given its surprising potential for liberating effects or enslavement. This urges us to think about technology and to use it and to be affected by it consciously. The role of mobster mentality in elites seeking power in disordered or shaken societies urges us, by contrast, to cultivate the virtues of an active citizenry, which is what is truly necessary to build responsible states and democratic societies. Finally, the fraudulent splendor of those total master plans, those utopian blueprints, is abundantly clear in the historical record. We must keep in mind that those ideas had consequences, and thus ideas need to be taken seriously. There is, moreover, another caution about amnesia as a danger. The very fact that the ideological dictatorships of this century, the 20th century, did not exist in vacuums, but as we've tried to emphasize, interacted, fought with one another, on other occasions learnt from one another, and occasionally imitated one another, carries a crucial implication. It's dangerous to be unaware of their record if that record continues. There's a special danger in forgetting these phenomena and crimes of the 20th century, which could lead to revivals. And the signs here are not all that positive right now. After communism's collapse in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, scarcely any leaders were held accountable or were put on trial for their crimes. The same is true in the case of other regimes worldwide, whom we've discussed, such as the Khmer Rouge. Such amnesia, though it's perhaps initially comfortable, poisons responsible politics in the long run and distorts the mature historical consciousness that a society needs. In Russia today, for instance, and I've found this even in discussion with Russians whom I've met in the course of my teaching, communist symbols have returned, while newly discovered mass graves in Russia are ignored by the public at large, in spite of the efforts of brave organizations like Memorial, who seek to keep alive the memory of these atrocities. In a poll that was conducted throughout Russia in 2003, on the very 50th anniversary of Stalin's death, 53% of all of those who were asked of this Russian audience approved of Stalin. Only 33% disapproved. Amnesia indeed. In Germany in 2003, an East German communist theme park is being planned by a Berlin company to allow people to go back in time and to experience those days of fervor. Here, kitsch, being produced through the experiences of suffering, is a way of adding insult to injury. But I'd like to close on a basis for cautious optimism. Philosophers continue to debate whether utopias are indispensable to human beings as we really are, perhaps the precondition for any kind of progress. Our survey of the historical record of the last century urges us to be vigilant against revivals and new forms of the total ideologies, as well as urging us to take on a certain humility and caution even as we engage in utopian thought experiments. Finally, the heroism and humanity of the witnesses to the century we've considered, as well as countless other unknown people who confronted terror regardless of their own fates and often paid the ultimate price, provide an example that's not utopian or imagined, but historically and existentially very real. Their courage and humanity are causes for hope for us in our new century.